that if you have a foreign speaker from New York and he is in Holland and he had to fly back emergently back to the States due to a family problem, but he will be online. And what is the chance that the other guy who will be online is on a military mission and that his replacement is on a funeral of a family member and we have to search for another replacement. Also, this is only this day, and everything worked out. So I still hope that we have a beautiful evening for you, and that will start with Hans van Schuppen. Everyone knows Hans van Schuppen as a very modest guy, but his modesty is even big as himself because he's a really great guy and he knows a lot about cardiac arrest. He's the chair of the famous arrest group, which collects enormous amount of data in the big Amsterdam area of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest and has one of the largest out-of-hospital cardiac arrest databases in the world. And you can have a lot of data from his arrest database. He is not only researcher and a great guy, but also an emergency anesthesiologist in Amsterdam and also a member of the HEMS crew in the Lifeliner 1. He will talk about the future of cardiac arrest, and this whole evening will be about the future of cardiac arrest, how the care of cardiac arrest patients will evolve in the very near future. And Hans will talk about the ultra early detection of cardiac arrest. You can't detect it even earlier. Hans, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Well, don't believe everything Denise says. That's the first thing of introduction. Thank you very much, Denise, for the invitation and the kind introduction as well. It's such an honor and pleasure to be here. I mean, cardiac arrest is a great passion of mine. I think it is work worthwhile. It's about life and death, and we really should make the maximum effort that we can do to save everybody's life, because life is so worthwhile, isn't it? So it starts off all with the detection of cardiac arrest when it occurs. And in the next half hour, I would like to get on a journey to see what has been developing and also what can you expect. I would like to make it a little bit broader than watches alone, but we'll come to that later. And just to start off, to add a conflict of interest, I receive grants from Stryker Emergency Care, but that's outside the scope of this talk. Well, as you can see, it's about the future, right? So I started off with a picture made by Copilot. I asked Copilot just to create an image for my presentation on a smartwatch detecting cardiac arrest in this chap, which is quite unfortunate, as you can see. And it's actually interesting because I think nobody could have expected just like 1 or 2 years ago that you can actually talk to your computer, ask the computer to generate an image for your presentation, but here it is. So talking about smartwatches and detection of cardiac arrest, just to start off with a question, who thinks that the technology will become available within like a week, or do you think it will take a year, or do you think it will take like 3 years? Can I see like a show of hands? Who think it will take a week before the technology will be there to detect cardiac arrest? Who thinks it will take a year? Who thinks it will take 2 years? Okay, interesting. Hold that thought. So, as said, cardiac arrest, of course, it begins all with detection, and that's the reason why in basic life support courses, people really get trained to recognize cardiac arrest in the first place. So people are unresponsive, not breathing normally. We even include videos of actors with agonal breathing and stuff just to train people to recognize cardiac arrest. And that's crucial. But then, of course, you have to have a bystander actually there during the collapse. And unfortunately, in 1 out of 3 cardiac arrests, and that's both for the Netherlands and also average for whole Europe, there is no one around. And that's a challenge, because if nobody's there, you will probably not survive. The chances of you surviving cardiac arrest, of an unwitnessed cardiac arrest, is very small. But also, in cases of a witnessed cardiac arrest, I think you're all healthcare professionals, right? I think you have all witnessed cardiac arrests, talking to family, relatives, and them describing what happened during the collapse, and then they slapped their face, they got some water, splashed it into their face, they run to the neighbors to get some help, nobody was there, they actually phoned the general practitioner, he was on sick leave, so he got another GP, etc., 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 and time ticks away with a witnessed cardiac arrest. So prompt detection is not only very important for unwitnessed cardiac arrest, it's also very important for witnessed cardiac arrest. You all know this concept, right? The chain of survival. And the difficulty and the challenge with cardiac arrest is that everything needs to go perfect. But the first step is detection, recognition. And if that doesn't happen, the rest of the chain of survival won't take place. And it also changes its form. If you look at the fact that not only that the cardiac arrest is prolonged before the resuscitation attempt starts, the cause of the cardiac arrest is also time critical. If you look at, for example, ventricular fibrillation, one of the major causes of cardiac arrest, this is a time critical arrhythmia. I think that probably all of you would have had some experience of people going into VF while being awake. Is that correct? Can I see a show of hands of people experiencing it? Okay. And what happened? I hope you did something. What did you do? Yeah, you gave them a shock, and then what? Yeah, sometimes it's even like the commercial, right? Like even Apeldoorn like wake up and then somebody wakes up, right? So VF actually has a very good prognosis if you're there, if you recognize it, and if you can deliver a shock right away. And that's where the challenge is. So that means that in out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, and we've been studying this in the arrest group, like mentioned, the Amsterdam Resuscitation Studies Group, which collects data on out-of-hospital cardiac arrests since 2005. We've been taking a closer look on this, and I want to show you some very recent results, which are still under peer review, so please no photos. But here you can see the percentage of survival of a VF out-of-hospital OCA related to the time to first defibrillation. So if you would have VF in your house, what do you want to have? Like, how fast do you want your shock delivered? Is that within 6 minutes? Or would straight away, exactly. So the sooner the better. Yeah, of course, 6 minutes is a good target, like in the feasibility perspective, but the sooner the better, right? I mean, you need to shock them right away. Another thing is, people are all like hyped about refractory VF, with double sequential defibrillation, what's better than one defib, it's like 2 defibs. But the thing is, it's not actually refractory VF, it's like recurrent VF. But that's another presentation. But if you really want to tackle this problem for people just keep showing VF in written checks, you need to speed things up. Also unpublished still is under review in a large medical journal. And here you can see the time between the emergency call and the first shock by any defibrillator, so that's AED or a manual defibrillator, and the amount of shocks that that patient will receive during the course of the resuscitation. And again, the question, how fast would you want your first shock? I think the sooner the better, right? So in other words, you want to have a prompt recognition. And that's important for survival. It's also important for the cause of the arrest, like being immediately treated. And there's also one very, very important reason as well, because we can do in this hospital, there are like magnificent things possible, like all this ECPR and stuff, but it only will work with prompt detection of cardiac arrest. So if you put that in a different figure, like in the chain of survival, but then in perspective, Charles Deacon has done so and published this in Resuscitation. Like if the first circle would be all out of hospital cardiac arrests, the second circle would be actually half of the patients in cardiac arrest will actually receive a resuscitation attempt. And a quarter of that half will actually reach a defibrillation attempt and advanced life support, et cetera, et cetera. So that means that a lot of patients with out-of-hospital cardiac arrest actually get stuck in the first link of the chain of survival. So there's much to be gained. Right. What has been developing in these things? Well, of course, people call the dispatch center first. So how can we improve that process? One of the very interesting developments is the instant on-scene or the instant help modality from Good Sam. This has actually been launched in the UK, also now in other parts of the world, where the dispatch center can actually get approval from the caller and then being able to look through the camera of the smartphone, because they allow the dispatcher to actually look to the victim. And it actually has face recognition of the victim, and that can analyze through the video the pulsatility, so the heart rate of the victim, because of color fluctuations in the pixels. And that actually helps to detect cardiac arrest. So I tried to have a small video on this, how that shows. So if you amplify the colors with 100 times, you could actually see somebody's heart pulsating blood through the face. And you can actually count this as well per minute. So in other words, there has been some development on like faster recognition of cardiac arrest by the dispatcher. But of course, this talk was about smartwatches. And I think the first major release was with the Apple Watch with fall detection. It is not cardiac arrest specifically, but most of the times, or at least a lot of times, people with cardiac arrest fall. And if you can detect that prompt emergency response, it's like a start. But of course, it can do more because it has quite some sensors. It has accelerometry, it has heart rate, it has breathing. Some even have like blood pressure types of measurements, oxygen saturation type of measurements. These devices are filled with sensors. So that means that we need to talk business. And in the Netherlands, there are 3 consortia busy with this thing, with this project, creating a wearable like a smartwatch which can detect cardiac arrest. So the first is HeartSafe. It's a consortium with these partners that you can see. Patrick Schober, who you probably or may also know, is a professor in anesthesiology in Amsterdam UMC, also HEMS physician, leads the HeartSafe consortium, working together with all these partners. We have the BECA consortium, beating cardiac arrest, also very nice. A colleague of mine from Amsterdam UMC, together with these partners, are working on this as well. And we have a third consortium that's called the Detect consortium, which is led by the Radboud UMC. And I understood that Erasmus also participating, so that's very nice. So in other words, we as Dutch people like to, get things very well organized, and I think it's a good opportunity because it's very important. So what's out there else? I think a lot. I don't know if you know all this, but all these types of wearables are being developed to perform some sort of measurement of some sort of a body function. And I'm not sure what the chances are that all these types of devices will become available to actually detect cardiac arrest. But perhaps they can, be linked or fill in the gaps, or, some things, for example, if you have like fall detection, if you're like in bed while having your cardiac arrest, you don't fall, so you're screwed. You need something else. But on the other hand, it will be interesting to see what is feasible with all these devices. But anyway, there's lots going on. So how does such a consortium work? Well, of course, it involves many partners. There are various steps, but I think the HeartSafe project has a roadmap which is quite comparable to other consortia as well. And that first of all needs to have a device which is actually capable of detecting cardiac arrest. That's of course the thing that starts it off with. But you also need like users knowing how the device works, how to control the settings, willing to share the data, and that needs to be bundled into this engine block, the technology which actually triggers the alarm. Then, of course, it's very important that the alarm is not only like contained in the house, but it actually leads to the dispatch center or hartslag nu. So you need to have that coupled. And, of course, activate the dispatch center, because if else, you have a cardiac arrest with a resuscitation attempt by hartslag nu, burgerhulpverleners, citizen responders, but then EMS never showing up. So that means you need to involve the dispatch center as well. That is the whole concept of how these consortia work. Do people actually want this? I think that's also an interesting question, right? Would you like to have some? Can I see a show of hands for people would you be willing or would you be interested to have this functionality on your smartwatch? A majority. So that actually reflects one of the studies that we did with HeartSafe. We actually had a survey on the user perspective, and we had users from the consumer perspective with a market survey, but we also involved patients with a high risk of cardiovascular disease. And here you can see that almost everybody finds it quite interesting or very interesting. And you can see there's a little bit more on the patient side, which find it very interesting. Course. Would you really want one? Not only interested, but would you really want one? Then the majority would say yes, just reflecting the response that I just saw. So that's interesting as well. If people don't want it, what would be the reason why they don't want it? So the majority of those people actually said, I don't want to be resuscitated. Well, yeah, of course, that makes sense, right? If you don't want to be resuscitated, you don't need to function. So that means that's quite logical. Or you don't have a smartwatch and you're not interested in smartwatches whatsoever. Could be a generation thing there, I'm not sure. So what's their opinion on a little bit broader perspective? Would you recommend this? Should it be easy? All these things. Do you want your data to protect it? All the quite logical stuff. But the tendency is that people are, quite positive to very positive. So that means there's a willingness for this technology on the population side, but also on the patient side. So what type of studies are people working on in these consortia? I just show you some results from a survey. That's of course interesting. These are surveys for people in the general population, but also patients. We also have a survey with our paramedics in the Netherlands, our ambulance nurses. And I think it's also good to have some user experience. So if the device is developed, how do people feel wearing these devices? That's important as well, of course. For the algorithm side of things, there is like a graded approach. Usually all the consortia usually start off with healthy volunteers and then applying a tourniquet or like a blood pressure cuff and inflate it fully and see how the device triggers a response. Does it detect the absence of heart rhythm, heart rate, or pulsatility? Then, of course, in a hospital, we sometimes see people without a pulse. You can think of emergency department, but also in the OR, on the bypass. You can think of cath lab with ICD placements, and that's the kinds of stuff. You can think of patients in the ICU in which they reach the stage where there's withhold of treatment. All these different settings in which people lose their circulation. And that's an opportunity to test these devices. Furthermore, there will be some studies on target group studies. So that means based on data from our REST database, we're now looking into which type of patient characteristic would be most beneficial. For example, I can, if I would have like 100 watches, I can, share it with you all. And then in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll probably catch I hope none cardiac arrests with you guys. But the chances of us actually catching a cardiac arrest is very low. So that means that you need to understand which type of people would be the most relevant group for this technology to become available. Well, that is other studies and many more. I mean, we should include like observational studies on timelines and all these things from early experience. But of course, this leads to a lot of questions. First of all, you will never want to have a false positive. You will never want to have a false negative. How about all the different companies actually creating such a device? What is the dispatch center perspective if we would have like 50 types of devices in the next couple of years? How to deal with that? Have you ever considered, responding to an alert and then reaching the address and the door being closed? It's like, okay, there you are with your AED, great, but how do you get into the house? These practical things, we don't have any experience, and this is all new stuff. This is all innovation. And I think the only way forward is to have studies to embrace that it's new and to learn along the way. I think that's the most important thing. So coming back to my question, what's the right answer? Is it 1 week? Is it 1 year? Or is it 2 years? The answer is 1 week. The new Google Pixel Watch 3 has a functionality which is called the loss of pulse detection. It's the first of its kind feature. This is a watch capable, at least they claim, that it's capable of detecting cardiac arrest. And they're not very much afraid to share how this all looks. It's not out on the market yet, but almost, come to that later. And how it works, it is actually based on an AI-driven algorithm which detects movement. It will detect your pulse and it will check if you're okay by asking if you're okay. So in other words, if you respond or not. And if that's not the case, and it's actually, the person's actually wearing it, it's not on your, on the table or somewhere, then it will prompt an audio alert, count to 20 back, and if you haven't responded then, it will notify the dispatch center, including your GPS location.
I think the average person doesn't think about their pulse. It's something that we take for granted. The phrase loss of pulse is one that many people may not have heard of, but a loss of pulse event could really happen to anyone.
Loss of pulse is a health emergency when the heart is not beating in a life-sustaining fashion. We have all of this infrastructure in place to get people help as quickly as possible, but it's all predicated on the idea that someone will be there to make a call to emergency medical services on your behalf. But we know that more than half the time, people experience these events with no one around, and they are virtually unsurvivable if you don't have someone to help. So we've built a loss of pulse detection feature for the Pixel Watch that is the first of its kind. It can detect if someone has lost their pulse, is non-responsive, and can make a call to emergency medical services where key information is provided, like the location of where the user is, so they can get help as quickly as possible.
A loss of pulse event is really a time-critical emergency. The feature is specifically looking for a pulse, but also looking at physiological and motion data, and then tying these together in a really smart algorithm driven by AI that lives completely on the watch. When a loss of pulse event occurs, every minute that we can save increases the odds of survival.
We hope this can be an airbag moment or smoke detector moment, something that can become standard to help keep us safe when life may bring the unexpected.
So, no conflict of interest at this stage. I am arranging a meeting next week with them because the Netherlands will be one of the first countries in which this will become available when all the legal things have been sorted. So perhaps the second answer is, or third answer perhaps is not wrong as well. I don't know how long it will take to, cover all the legal aspects, and that's quite a bit, but the technology is there. So that means I think that there's, many questions still left unanswered, but we better get going because this is going fast. If you want one, you can buy one, and there it has on the, that's the first answer, right, in 1 week, available on September 10th. So it's very actual presentation. Made this screenshot today. So how about if you, yes, sorry.
It's okay to ask.
Yeah?
Do they claim to detect a certain percentage?
Good question. So they don't. At least I searched PubMed and stuff, and there's no references. So they actually built this system of volunteers with the blood pressure cuff type of simulation. So it's not been validated in actual cardiac arrest as far as I know. Again, maybe there is unpublished data they have not shared. I'm hoping to learn soon, but it will definitely be interested to validate. Of course, not everybody can afford such a watch or wants one or whatever. So there must be still ways to use other technology. And one of the other things is, for example, surveillance camera. You can use artificial intelligence to recognize collapse patterns and people laying there on the ground movelessly without any movement, or perhaps even with not normal breathing, or catching sound of snoring and stuff. So this can also be helpful because there are quite some cameras, especially in China, by the way. So you can also use smart speakers. Usually they have microphones, being in the background, waiting for you to say hey Google, or hey Apple thing, Siri, responding to your voice. So it means it's actually listening all the time. I'm not sure if you know. I'm not sure if you have one in your bedroom, but I'll leave that up to you. It is listening all the time. And that means that it is capable of picking up gasping. So agonal breathing, that sounds like when people go into cardiac arrest, like that type of stuff. It can call the emergency services for you if you can't. So that's also a possibility. Coming to a conclusion, here you can see the outcomes of cardiac arrest since that we have started the arrest registry. And in the early years, you can still see some increase in survival. But unfortunately, the last year, so that's not really recent, but there is some plateau effect. And the question is, what are we going to do? Are we going to do more of the same? Another BLS course, another AED somewhere, another ALS course? Or are we going to do something really different? And we will hear about other technologies later, this program. But my plea is that we should definitely invest massively in early detection of cardiac arrest. That's the way of the future to increase survival. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Before asking to the public if there are any questions to Hans, I want to ask the public if someone wants to buy my Garmin Phoenix 7 watch. It has solar function because I want to buy a new watch. Is there anyone who has a question for Hans? There has to be a ton, yeah. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. So how about elderly people who might not be willing or able to buy such a device or use it in the first place. Is that your question? Is that right? Okay, good. So yeah, it's a good question, really. I mean, especially with the target audience, a little bit older group with comorbidities and stuff, they may not be as modern, adaptable with all these smart technologies. It is actually one of the challenges of developing such a device, that you actually develop it in such a way that you don't need to be a whiz kid to actually understand it and use it. Regarding finance, it's quite interesting as well. I'm not sure about how health insurance companies would actually respond to this development, because it's obvious that you can really prevent prolonged ICU admissions, let example. But then again, as always, the cheapest patient is a deceased patient, but that just, let alone that argument. But I think that it's really important that we should make the design very easy, also for elderly people. And I think that the financial thing is very important as well. I actually showed this video to my kids as well. They're the future, right? I mean, I would like to have their response, and their immediate response is, why are they keeping that to themselves? Why not, share it with all the other manufacturers? I found that really, really cute and a good point, actually. Yeah.
Your question answered? Okay. Any other questions?
I just would like to add a little bit of answer to the previous question. The DETECT consortium actually published quite recently an article in the Lancet Digital Health with the very early findings of patients in the cath lab receiving TAVI, and they actually report very high sensitivity and specificity on the detection of their device. Yeah.
Sean?
I was just wondering if you could repeat for us what agonal breathing sounds like.
Something like that. Is that okay?
Great applause for Hans. Hans, thank you very much for coming all the way from Amsterdam to Rotterdam. This is a big journey, I know. Before getting to the next speaker, Felipe Teran, I would like to have two housekeeping messages. One is that we are taking photographs for social media. If you don't want to be on a photograph, please come to us in the coffee break. Then we'll make you black at the photos. And the other one is, if you don't have already the chance of registering your QR code, please come in the coffee break to us. Then we can register you, and then you get your points, your accreditation points. Then I hope that Felipe Teran is online. Felipe is from New York, and he's associate professor in emergency medicine. And he is the guy worldwide that is optimizing chest compressions and chest compressions during cardiac arrest. So we've now talked about detection of cardiac arrest, and the next step is, if you are in cardiac arrest, how to optimize flow. And we don't know if we are doing CPR, then we don't have feedback on how we're performing. And Philippe is the expert in providing the feedback loop, how we are doing chest compressions, and if we are doing that on the right way. Philippe, I'm very, very happy that you're with us, even if it's online. I'm very proud to have you here. Philippe, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Philippe. It would help if you unmute yourself, perhaps.
Sorry about that. It's my first time using Zoom. Just kidding. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, we're hearing you okay.
Great. And perhaps if you can mute yourself, I do unfortunately have an echo from your end. Feel free to unmute yourself if you need to say anything, but I think it'll be better. It is my honor to join this this conversation, this meeting, and to follow my good friend Hans. I have not yet had the pleasure to meet in person Dennis and the rest of the team at Rotterdam, but I look forward to doing that in the next opportunity. I think this topic fits very well, not only within today's sort of theme of the future of cardiac arrest. To some extent, I think this is the present of cardiac arrest. It's a present opportunity, but also I think fits very well with many other exciting interventions and developments in this area, including the use of ECMO and ECLS specifically, and Dina's team with the on-scene trial, which was the regional reason why we connected, I think represents a perfect example of the new landscape of cardiac arrest and resuscitation care across the globe, in this case in the Netherlands. And I'm very excited to be part of this international conversation where we can together not just imagine the future of cardiac arrest, but hopefully actually design the path to implement many of these strategies that can help us improve outcomes in the end. That's at the end of the day, that's what we all want. I'm a researcher and clinician at Cornell University in New York City. And what I want to tell you today is what I've been working on for the last several years, and that is the application of transesophageal echo in cardiac arrest. Many of you I know in the audience are anesthetists or intensivists, some emergency physicians. And so many of you have experience and expertise with this modality. It has been widely used in the operative setting for several decades. But it's only for the last couple of decades that we've really, I think, come to understand the potential of this modality in cardiac arrest resuscitation specifically. I want to tell you about a couple of relevant disclosures. I have several hats. As an educator, I run an international initiative called the Resuscitation Project, where I'm a faculty and founding member. I'm also one of the course directors for a course that teaches transesophageal echo with focus in resuscitation, and that's the Resuscitation workshop. I'm also a consultant for Philips and Sonoside on matters related to transesophageal echo and education in that area. And on the research side of things, which is, I would say, my primary job these days, I'm the principal investigator for the multi-center study called RT-CORE, or Resuscitation Collaborative Registry, which I'll describe today. And among other sources of funding, I have funding from the NIH, which is currently funding some of the work that I'm actually going to discuss today. There's a lot of exciting data that is coming out. Much of it is actually currently under analysis and not published. And so I'm going to be very careful and hopefully tell you exactly what's the status of the data that I will be presenting to you. And I mentioned the funding because I think we all, as scientists, would like to believe that we are agnostic as to whether our hypothesis will actually pan out in the end. But the reality is that as researchers, not just because of funding, but because ultimately it's human nature, we either believe or don't believe in the things that we work on. And of course, you want to believe in what you're working on. And so in this case, I do believe that this modality can actually impact the care of patients in cardiac arrest and that can improve outcomes ultimately. And so think about that as an important source of bias from my perspective. This is a picture of our team actually a few years ago at University of Pennsylvania waiting for a patient with out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. And you can see here the TE probe hanging from an IV pole just next to the airway equipment, ready to be used during the resuscitation. And this is an image that I think many of you who might have not seen the use of this modality in cardiac arrest might not be familiar with. But I find that this is an image that makes it really helpful to understand the value. It was when I saw an image like this for the first time, when I did a TE in cardiac arrest, that I immediately understood the potential of this modality. For years, we've been essentially managing cardiac arrests in a fashion that is analogous to really a black box. We really can't see the heart. We can't know what's going on inside. We make assumptions. We try to use diagnostic tests. But for the most part, up until this point, we've really never had an opportunity to actually visualize the heart in real time. And so it is this unique ability of TE or TRE to visualize the heart in real time that is really at the core of its potential in this area. This is our setting in the emergency department. This is out of hospital cardiac arrest patients coming in. This is sort of our setup waiting for one of those patients. And I want to show you this because this is just, in this case, transesophageal echo is just one element in this sort of multi-part system to deliver what I think is advanced cardiac arrest care. You can include obviously the use of ECMO in a portion of these patients, well, that will require a similar approach to be deployed in an organized fashion. And many systems, this same setup is being deployed in the pre-hospital. And I think that's obviously where we ultimately would want to deploy interventions like this. Just like ECMO, transesophageal echo would make sense as soon as possible in the pre-hospital setting. But most of the experience that I have and the data that I'm going to present to you today is actually from the emergency department setting or the in-hospital setting when these patients are arriving to the hospital. And in terms of the application of TE in cardiac arrest, this is actually not a new idea. We did not come up with it. It was actually cardiologists that were working back in the 90s. This is a team out of UCSF in California that performed the first couple of studies, small sort of case series, where they were using actually this modality, transesophageal echo, as a way to understand CPR physiology. And many scientists, even people in cardiac arrest, I think, don't know the fact that many of the really truths, or what we believe to be the truths in many of the assumptions in cardiac arrest physiology that we believe to be true today, come from really a couple of studies from the 90s that demonstrated, in this case, what was happening to the cardiac chambers doing CPR, and specifically what was happening to the valves. Many of you are familiar with the concept of cardiac pump theory, which essentially proposes that it is the direct compression of the left ventricle that generates forward flow in cardiac arrest. And this, among other things, was described with the help of transesophageal echo by visualizing the direction of the valves. You can see here how much worse these images were, obviously back in the day. But even with these quality of images, these physicians were able to make sense of the direction of blood flow during cardiac arrest. So this is kind of where the origins of the use of this modality in resuscitation started. And while I'm going to concentrate primarily on the application in cardiac arrest specifically, in order to augment CPR quality specifically and try to improve forward flow, there are a number of other applications of transesophageal echo, including the use of this modality in resuscitation of cardiac arrest patients. For instance, the guidance of endovascular procedures, and one of those endovascular procedures that many of you there are familiar with is VA ECMO in the setting of cardiac arrest. the use of transesophageal echo in ACLS as essentially an alternative to fluoroscopy when we're doing percutaneous cannulation simply makes a lot of sense. We have the ability to visualize the descending thoracic aorta to confirm the placement of the guide wire, as well as on the venous side, the actual placement of our cannula in order to avoid complications such as perforation of the right atrium or going through the intraatrial septum or misplacing that drainage cannula. So I'm not going to describe this, but this is just to give you a sense of really the versatility of this modality is really going to help us do more than just one thing doing the resuscitation. And I think that's an important aspect that we need to think about when we think about implementing any modality in resuscitation. So let's get to sort of the meat of the sandwich, at least for this presentation, and that is the application of T in cardiac arrest specifically. As Hans already pointed out, cardiac arrest is a huge problem. This is just in the United States, almost 400,000 patients a year. And really the main problem is that despite decades of research and many millions of dollars invested, we continue to have survival outcomes from hospital discharge that are essentially under 20%, and in many cases, well under 15% for all comers, with better outcomes for those with shockable rhythms, as we know. But overall, this is just really bad outcomes in general. And this is why we're so excited about any modality that can help us improve that percentage. And so I want to remind you that in 2024, we really just don't have many therapies available for patients in cardiac arrest. It really comes down to high quality CPR, epinephrine, and defibrillation in those cases that can benefit from it. And every once in a while, in rare cases where we have the ability to diagnose a reversible pathology like cardiac tamponade, we have this unique ability or possibility rather to treat that pathology and hopefully get a return of spontaneous circulation. But if you have been managing cardiac arrest for any significant period of time, you have already realized that it is really the minority of cases in cardiac arrest where we are able to find that diagnostic culprit, that diagnostic intervenable pathology. The large majority of cases, whether they're old or young, will be managed throughout the resuscitation with a number of assumptions from a diagnostic standpoint. But in most cases, we're not going to actually have the ability to identify what's happening. It's really in a small portion of the cases that we're going to be able to find that pathology and occlusion in the LAD and in the context of a STEMI. And obviously, we will want to take that patient to the cath lab. But for the most part, we are going to be left with really not many options in resuscitation other than these three therapies that I described before. And this is why the opportunity to support patients with ECMO, with VA ECMO specifically, makes so much sense. And so I want to frame the use of transesophageal echo here, not as a therapy, because it's really not a therapy, but rather as another modality that can help us improve the effectiveness of those therapies that we already have, specifically CPR. So right now, if you're dealing with a cardiac arrest, you're going to be essentially cycling through these three options in most cases. This is what ACLS tells us to do. And every 3 to 5 minutes, we're going to give a new dose of epinephrine. And somehow, in most of these cases, we expect to have a different outcome. We somehow expect to generate enough coronary perfusion pressure and get ROSC. And so this is what many, including this gentleman, had described as insanity. It's really expecting to get a different result, trying the same thing all over again, or over and over again. And so this is where my interest in CPR physiology really started, and where the main focus of transesophageal echo can be found. The reality is that it's been almost 60 or over 60 years, really, since these gentlemen essentially defined how we performed closed chest CPR back in the 60s. And since then, we really haven't changed things much. We have a framework that we use to understand resuscitation, and one of those key aspects is early CPR. But the way in which we're doing CPR is exactly the same as we were doing it over 60 years ago. And it just doesn't make much sense that we haven't changed at all the way we're doing CPR when we are not getting great results with it. And so when you look at images like this and see the potential of visualizing the heart in real time and visualizing cardiac structures like the aortic valve, in this case, on the right side at the bottom, and the mitral valve, visualizing the direction of flow, visualizing where actually we're compressing, it's very clear that there's great potential to use this modality in resuscitation. And I mentioned that there are many different, I think, potential benefits. And probably the one that people think about the most is diagnostic. There will be cases, as I mentioned earlier, unfortunately not often enough, where we identify sort of the smoking gun. We identify the presence of a diagnostic of a pathology that we believe represents the culprit. In this case, for instance, it's a large occlusive thrombus that is essentially leading to obstructive shock etiology. And there's no high quality CPR that will get us ROSC in that case. We need to deal with that large clot. Or cases like this one with pericardial effusion, signs of tamponade physiology, similar situation where we need to treat that and intervene before we can expect gaining ROSC. And so one of the other applications or benefits of visualizing with such high quality images the heart in real time is the identification of what's been described as fine ventricular fibrillation. These are cases where if you look at the monitor, you believe that you're seeing a systole because there is no clear fibrillatory activity. But if you were to amplify that waveform, you could see that the myocardium is actually fibrillating. And we have the opportunity here with transesophageal echo to actually identify those cases, whether that actually leads to a higher fraction of cases where we can ROSC and obviously good outcomes. We don't know yet. This is not a common phenomenon, but it's something that has been described and that we all have seen plenty of times. It is one of the things that we're studying with a registry that I mentioned in a couple of minutes. And if you happen to identify that patient, one of the benefits of this modality is that we can actually defibrillate that patient under real sort of a real-time image of that heart without any problem. In some cases, we are going to get lucky and identify clear signs of RV dilation and RV overload in the setting of, for instance, a pulmonary embolism. This is a view of the right pulmonary artery with a partially occlusive thrombus in the setting of what was later confirmed to be a large PE, which was the culprit of a cardiac arrest in that case. And so these are sort of straightforward diagnostic applications of TE, which I think is important to know about. And we and many others are interested in studying and understanding the potential impact of this modality when we identify those pathologies and intervene. We have the ability to guide some procedures to assess whether interventions that we've initiated are actually working. But I want to really concentrate and spend the last 10 minutes on this one specific opportunity that I believe is where really the money is from an outcome standpoint for this application. And that is, as I showed you in those images earlier, the ability to actually guide in real time and be able to individualize the way we perform CPR. So I imagine that in 2024, we shouldn't be pressing on this chest blindly. We should be pressing ideally on this chest with some type of information, ideally real-time information about that patient, that individual patient in front of us, anatomy. The anatomy of that patient, where is the left ventricle, where is the optimal place to compress in order to generate the optimal forward flow, and of course, to prevent something like obstruction of forward flow. So as I mentioned, according to the cardiac pump theory, the whole purpose of why we're doing CPR, why we want to do CPR early, is to compress the left ventricle between the sternum and the spine. And at this point, there's been really a dozen or more studies from radiology, diagnostic modalities, CTs, MRIs, that have essentially showed rather consistently at this point that the structures that are located under the left ventricle, under the sternum, are not always, in fact, are almost, are most infrequently the left ventricle. In many cases, it's the ascending aorta. In many cases, the left ventricle outflow tract. In a large majority of cases, it's actually the aortic root and the aortic valve. So it is fairly easy to understand then why studies that were performed about a decade ago using transesophageal echo in patients with out-of-hospital cardiac arrest found the fact that in many patients, when we compress their chest using the standard sort of guideline recommendations, compressing with our hands between the nipples and the interlippal line at the center of the chest, in many cases, you can see in this figure, we are actually obstructing the outflow tract. We're obstructing the way in which the blood is supposed to be ejected through. And according to some of those studies, it was up to 40% of cases where the obstruction was happening. This is a study by a Korean study, Wong in 2009, actually, so over a decade ago, almost at this point, 2 decades ago, where they even correlated the distance from the aortic valve in stroke volume. It's not a strong correlation, but this is the first time that we knew, according to the study in a small sample, that where we compress in the heart and where we compress along the left ventricle, and specifically how close to the aortic valve we get, actually correlates with the stroke volume that we generate. And more studies have supported this since then, including some that have been conducted by our team, which I'll describe shortly. And so at the center of this idea here, or our hypothesis, if you will, is the idea that we have the ability to visualize the left ventricle, the mitral valve, the aortic valve in one plane in this view called mid-esophageal long axis view, and see whether we are actually doing a good job or not. And what you see here is an example of a patient with mechanical CPR, where we are performing CPR in the context of a PA arrest. As you can see there, end-tidal CO2 is 11. You know that end-tidal CO2 of 11 correlates with very low likelihood of gaining ROSC and likely a very low coronary perfusion pressure. And in this case, the area of the heart that we're compressing seems to be adequate, seems to be the left ventricle. However, the depth does not seem adequate. And this is actually, for me, very intuitive. It makes perfect sense, right? Is it possible that across individuals in our population, depending on the size, the type of chest that you have, that in some people, the one-size-fits-all standardized recommendation of compression depth that we provide might not be sufficient? Well, this is an image essentially demonstrating that. This was a case where we were not generating good compression of the left ventricle, despite being in the right position. And under mechanical CPR, you don't really have the opportunity to change that. It's a fixed sort of force generated by the piston. In this case, therefore, we swap to manual CPR, and you see that it's evident that we have switched to manual because the compressions are a lot more irregular. We're moving kind of a lot more, and there's more bouncing, but at the same time, we can control the depth better. We see a better opening of the aortic valve, and then most importantly, we see improvement of that end-tidal CO2. that entitled CO2 continues to rise as we optimize that compression depth in that individual patient. And eventually that leads to entitled CO2 that's high enough that correlates with, again, a very high likelihood of gaining ROSC. And that is exactly what happened in this patient. We gained ROSC after providing that real-time improvement. So this is an example of a case, and this is sort of the left and right images are the beginning and the end of this example. This is an example where we're essentially demonstrating the potential to tailor the compression depth. This is assuming that we have found the right compression location, and now we have the opportunity to actually provide what we think are optimal compressions from the perspective of the depth. This is just one example of how we can intervene in these chest compressions. This will be kind of the full progression of that, and I like to look at this image, sort of this series of clips, because this is how I understand this the real value of this modality. Rather than a snapshot or a still image of the heart, what you have here is the entire film, the entire movie of your resuscitation. And that is obviously much more informative than just one photograph, one snapshot image. We can actually understand over time what needs to be done. So that's the first sort of aspect of this. But what I believe is potentially the lowest hanging fruit is the possibility of avoiding what we and many others have already confirmed to be a prevalent problem, and that is the obstruction of the left ventricular outflow tract. As you see in the image on the left, we are performing CPR, and we are essentially not allowing that aortic valve to be open at any point. In the image on the right, we have repositioned the hands. In that particular case, we moved the hands slightly downward and to the left in order to get closer to the apex in order to generate forward flow. If you don't believe that that actually does anything, this is an image in the transgastric approach of that same left ventricle. And I'm not a physicist, but I know that in order to generate a change in pressure, you need to generate a change in volume. And there is no change in volume between the end diastolic diameter and systolic diameter of that left ventricle. So regardless of what you think is happening in the left ventricular outflow tract, in that particular case, the left ventricle that we're supposed to be compressing is actually not having anything. And even more outrageous cases like this one, where there's essentially effective intermittent or continuous clamping of the aorta as we deliver CPR. And you might ask, well, does that matter? And the answer is definitively yes. There's been a number of studies in pre-hospital and preclinical environments in the laboratory from at least 3 different groups, including our group, essentially demonstrated that there is a correlation between the area of maximal compression and the probability of ROSC. In this case, this study demonstrated that if you compress the left ventricular outflow tract as standard guideline recommendation sort of landmark, in most cases, in this particular experiment, simply could not obtain ROSC. And it was only when you guided the compressions to compress the left ventricle that you could get, in this case, 70% ROSC, as well as higher coronary perfusion pressures, which we know are the primary determinant of ROSC. Our team at Cornell in our resuscitation lab have been doing that trial for the last 1.5 years, and we are in the phase of analysis of our of the experiments at this point, and we were doing exactly that, sort of a new approach where we're using transesophageal echo in real time, not just before we started the chest compressions, but actually in real time to ensure that we're compressing the left ventricle. So these are examples of those images. In pigs, they have slightly different anatomy, so don't get confused if you see here the omniplanes don't quite make sense, but we're able to obtain really good quality of images. We're able to visualize that heart doing ventricular fibrillation untreated, and then initiate CPR, simulating BLS and then simulating ACLS. As an example, of obstruction of the outflow tracts when we have randomized those pigs to have that. This is the publication of that model. We can see actually some of the tracings and the correlation with end-tidal CO2 and coronary perfusion pressures. Now, how common is this in real humans, you might ask? Well, the data that we have from our single center study from a couple of years ago is actually that happens in at least half of our patients with out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. And a study out of Milan, published just a few months after that one, that looked at patients going on ACLS specifically, identified for the first time that there was in fact a correlation between that left ventricular outflow tract being open and the probability of surviving at 24 hours. And this is the first time that we have had data as a primary outcome correlating the opening of the LVOT during the compression phase with 24-hour survival. And fast forward just in a couple of months ago in July of this year, this group of from Taiwan, led by Chu, published actually a very, very similar study to the study that we are currently undertaking. The difference is they did a single center study over several years. We are doing a very similar study with a set of 40 centers in an international collaboration that I will mention to wrap this up. But this study essentially looked at very similar questions. They use a slightly different approach in that they enrolled patients with out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, and they evaluated whether their aortic valve was compressed or not compressed during the CPR. So instead of this concept of left ventricular outflow tract versus left ventricle that we've employed, they went with a binary classification of aortic valve being compressed or uncompressed. And you can see these numbers are fairly small, but this was a prospective study that was really well conducted with all the data you would expect, including those Utstein variables that are necessary to account for in cardiac arrest to be able to evaluate the effect of this intervention. In this case, it had 39 and 37 patients in each of the groups, and very quickly going through the primary outcome, which for them was ROSC, they found a significant difference in those two groups with a very strong odds ratio of 4.7. So making it very clear that the patients that had a uncompressed aortic valve during the delivery of CPR had a much higher likelihood of gaining ROSC. And from a hemodynamic standpoint, one of their physiologic endpoints, which is similar to what we are doing as well, was actually also positive for the association in a rather also strong fashion between patients with aortic valve uncompressed in higher mean diastolic blood pressure. So you can see here 33 versus 11. That's a very, very, not just statistically significant difference, but also clinically significant. We know that you need to have a diastolic blood pressure at least of 20, which usually correlates with a coronary perfusion pressure of 15 or above, in order to generate ROSC. And so this is perfectly fitting with data that we have from animal studies as well as earlier studies from resuscitation in the 90s. So as I mentioned, a lot of the data that we have produced through this multi-center collaboration, the Resuscitate Collaborative Registry, which just completed its 1,250th enrollment a few weeks ago, with over 40 centers, is currently under review. The first manuscript has just been accepted and will be published in Annals of Emergency Medicine in the next probably 2 weeks. So stay tuned for that. This is a broader initiative that is looking to study outcomes of this modality, not just in cardiac arrest, but in a number of other applications, as you can see here. Those include shock, hemodynamic monitoring, and procedural guidance as well, in addition to both in-hospital and out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. We have mostly cardiac arrest patients across all sites, reflecting primarily the fact that we have a majority of emergency departments participating. In the absence of the data, peer review published data, I'm going to just show you some quick images from some of the work that has been presented at AHA in the last couple of years. This is the implementation of the registry. Again, this is very similar to what is coming out next week. 2 years ago, we did an analysis to look at the correlation between the area of maximal compression, specifically those patients that had obstruction of the outflow tract, and probability of ROSC in consistency with the recent study by the Taiwanese group. We did find there was such correlation between the AMC and ROSC. We have explored exciting opportunities such as also the training of models, machine learning assisted models, to do that same identification of the area of maximal compression. We've already trained a model and sort of described the feasibility of having the machine identify what we believe is clinically relevant, that being the compression of the outflow tract and distinguishing between good versus bad chest compressions. And we're looking to validate that with a larger sample. I can't show you again the latest data that is under analysis and will be hopefully published in the next few months, but I can tell you that we are actually powered at this point for an analysis for the first time between the area of maximal compression and not only ROSC, which as I showed you earlier, we have already found, but in the analysis of over 600 patients that we have at this point in both groups, we have found an association with survival. So stay tuned for that. It is obviously very relevant to connect for the first time the finding that when we identify in real time the compression of the outflow tract, that could predict different survival from hospital discharge. So that is ultimately what we are hoping to demonstrate, and the analysis that have been done at this point are showing that we're heading in the right direction. So stay tuned for that. A number of applications on the side of on the technology of this. Obviously, my vision for the future is that similar to what we do with defibrillators, where we have automated systems that can provide recommendations. I envision technology that might not necessarily include transesophageal echo or necessarily echocardiography at all, but technology that can help us identify what represents optimal compressions in individual patients and make recommendations in real time, such just like we do with the use of defibrillators today. So kind of summarizing what we know today: high quality CPR we know saves lives, and we know improves neurological outcomes. We know that we need left ventricular compression in order to deliver what we understand to be high quality CPR. We don't often compress the left ventricle at all, or in some cases, just not enough. And we often compress the outflow tract, which we know is bad. Both of those things lead to ineffective CPR. This is important, among other things. For instance, if we are deploying something very expensive and resource intensive like ECMO, we want to give those patients in eCPR the highest likelihood of surviving and having good outcome. And in order to do that, we would want to deliver the highest quality of CPR that we can. So we have that opportunity with real-time guidance in the case of TE, but there are many things that we still don't know, and we need probably a trial or another set of larger studies to evaluate that, as well as a clinical implementation. Among other things, we don't know exactly what happens when we start changing the site of compression. Are there repercussions for the lungs when we come off the sternum? Are there any other invasive or non-invasive markers that perhaps can serve as surrogates of these different types of CPR, good and bad CPR? How long do those real-time changes, for instance, in tidal CO2 or diastolic blood pressure, actually take to occur when we make those changes in real time. In order to have a tool that is effective in real time, it needs to reflect those changes ideally as quickly as possible. And so understanding what is the magnitude of those changes and what is the time of those changes, it is at the core of the questions that we're trying to address with the study that we're designing right now, that will hopefully include international centers, including Europe in the next few years. If you're interested in exploring and learning more about this, there's a good review from Jack from a couple of years ago that nicely summarizes sort of the theory and the available evidence. And if you're interested on the education, there are a number of resources and protocols available in the Resuscitation project's website as well. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I will take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. Are there any questions from the audience? Yeah, Isabel. I'm just giving you the microphone.
Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering what you would see if you used a TEE with the mechanical compression apparatus. How good does that work?
That is a great question, and there is data in the manuscript that is coming out in Annals of Emergency Medicine. As I said, in the next 2 weeks is already in sort of the final proof is approved. There is data there just showing basically the lack of any meaningful differences between mechanical and manual, which is something that we already looked at. So it is a very, I think, smart question, because I myself for a while had the concern that mechanical CPR devices actually might more often deliver worse quality of compressions. Our data so far has not shown that. Our data shows so far that when you control for type of CPR and separate between mechanical and manual, and we have approximately 55% of mechanical CPR in our cohort. So over half of the patients have been managed at some point with mechanical, don't have any significantly different outcomes or any other measures of resuscitation quality. With that said, what we have found, and this is the analysis that is not included in this first description, is that when you have mechanical CPR, is harder to make changes. The mechanical CPR devices, especially the piston-driven devices, are not designed to be moved. When I'm delivering manual CPR, I can essentially move my hands around, and also not just around, but I can change the direction of my vector in a different position if I need to. In the case of mechanical CPR, when we find that the compressions are inadequate, it's much more difficult, and in some cases impossible, to actually make an adjustment, because again, those devices have not been designed with that function in mind. And it wouldn't be surprising if future generation devices are able to do that. And there is a device in the market actually in Europe, without getting into sort of the brand issue, is not currently available in the US, but it is available in Europe, and the piston can be moved sort of laterally. And that's already an improvement, I think, from, or at least a difference from prior technology. Whether that makes a difference, obviously, we need to do studies to understand that. But we know for a fact that at least in our sample, there aren't any substantial differences between patients depending on what kind of CPR are receiving. However, it is very reasonable to believe that when we start looking at intervention, when we start looking at changes of chest compressions in response in response to that observation, that there might be differences between patients. So lots of interesting questions and lots of opportunities for research in this area for that same reason, but that's what we know so far.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. So if I understand correctly, most of the time we're compressing the outflow tract or not the right spot. And right?
That's correct. So
Yeah.
an easy way to summarize what we know so far is that it is a minority of patients in general that have compressions over the left ventricle. That's correct.
Yeah. Yeah. So until all ambulances are equipped with TE, wouldn't it be worth it to look into a different way of performing CPR, not taking the perpendicular nipple line, for example, but have a different standard using that, knowing that most of the times we're not effective now, picking another, changing the spot or the vector in general.
That is the million-dollar question. I think if there was a simple solution for this, I want to believe that somebody would have already done it. And there are studies, especially out of Europe, Theresa Olvesgegen and a few other investigators have looked at other modalities, including end-tidal CO2, to modify CPR in real time. And in general, I am not aware of any approach actually working from that perspective. That doesn't mean that it's not doable, but I think what we know is that it's not straightforward. I can offer just one more kind of element to maybe understand or help understand why this might not be straightforward. We know from our own experience, as well as some studies that have been published, also out of Asia, at least one of them, that not only we see variation across patients, between patients, in terms of their anatomy, but also we see variation intra patients. One same patient that has an optimal position for CPR at time 0 or time 10 minutes into resuscitation, 30 minutes later or 20 minutes later, might no longer actually have the right compression location in that spot. And that happens, I think, probably for a number of reasons, but the things that I can make sense include the fact that the heart actually moves during resuscitation, is actually bouncing a little bit and changing its position. Intravascular changes, we know, affect the position of the heart. PEEP and ventilation and the effects of ventilation are also probably changing. We've seen this in the lab with the animals. And I think we are just scratching the surface in terms of our understanding of what's happening to the heart in real time with these different interventions, whether you're giving volume or not, how you're ventilating, how much the architecture of the rib cage has been changed once we fracture some ribs and lose the recoil. That changes the intrathoracic pressure, that further changes also the position of the heart within the chest. And so I think there are a number of factors that are difficult to account for, but I think as a goal, as a target, it would be it would make a lot of sense to try to identify non-invasive approaches that could help us find that optimal spot for each individual patient. And if you're able to do that, I think you will get a big prize.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Before thank you very much for your great presentation, I would like to ask
Thank you.
the last question. And just in sake of time, I hope that you can answer it with one number. If I would be a good TE performer, and I'm
That's sorry, you sound a little bit far, but I think I understood the question. You asked about the number needed to become proficient, right? It's a very important question, and for those of you that are familiar with the training that I do, that our my colleagues, my team do, I think when we think about cardiac arrest, we're talking about the use of TE in a focused manner as opposed to comprehensive manner. And so while you need hundreds of cases, I think, to become proficient in comprehensive transesophageal echocardiography for operative procedures, for instance, for things like evaluating the heart doing chest compressions, to evaluate and obtain a 4-chamber window, to evaluate a long axis view, the data that we have from emergency medicine is that, first of all, there's no magical number, but that for physicians that have knowledge of transthoracic point of care ultrasound and echocardiography, for those physicians, somewhere between 10 and 30 studies are sufficient to be capable of developing the views and interpreting pathology. And that's more or less what's contained in the guidelines that are currently available, including the American Society of the American College of Emergency Physicians guidelines on the use of TE in resuscitation. So that's obviously it will depend on the background of training, but I can tell you that as intensivists, emergency physicians, we do a lot of procedures that actually already have prepared us for this procedure in terms of the hand-eye coordination and kinesthetic abilities. So it's a very doable number, and I think that's the bottom line.
Okay, we'll start again this when everyone is back. If we start earlier, we get earlier to the drinks. And we have a lot of good drinks. If I say drinks, everyone shuts up. That's good to know. The next speaker is Sean Scott. He's intensivist in the Barts Hospital in London. And he has trained many pre-hospital ECPR teams. Scotland, not Scotland, Sydney, London HEMS, and a lot of more HEMS stations that Sean has trained. I'm very proud to introduce Sean. Sean, he'll talk about the London HEMS experience.
Indeed. Can you guys hear me if I don't use the microphone?
Perhaps the people online can't hear you.
I'm going to use it anyway. All right. In that case, thank you, Denise, so much for inviting me. Thank you for having me at the HEMS base today for your training. And thank you all for joining us here this evening. I'm going to try and cut my presentation down by about 10 minutes because I hear that there are drinks afterwards. And I'd like to give the other speaker an opportunity to speak before we all run away. There was an order to this. I was supposed to speak last because what we're trying to do is bring together a lot of these practices that we're talking about tonight into one package to deliver to patients at the roadside with both Sydney HEMS and London HEMS. As Denise has said, I'm an intensivist and an emergency physician. I trained in Sydney. I live in Amsterdam and I work in London and Amsterdam and Sydney. Anyway, it's a bit complicated. Happy to talk about it over drinks. I have a few disclosures. They're all about education. As Denise has said, I do education. I do education for St. Bart's Hospital on ECMO. I do education with ELSO on ECMO. I do education with Learn ECMO on ECMO. I do a lot of ECMO education. I've been doing ECMO for cardiac arrest for well over a decade. ECMO for cardiac arrest is not the future. This is 2012. Everything that we've talked about, except for the smartwatches, is here. We've got ECMO, mechanical CPR, and in the back you'll see a lady with TOE on her badge, trans-esophageal echo, because the English spell it funny. So this is not new. This is not the future. The question a decade ago was, does eCPR work? It does. That question has been answered. The question for the future is, how do we deliver a package of cardiac arrest care from activation with smartwatches all the way through to rehabilitation in order to save lives? So what I want to talk to you about a little bit is my journey and how we're trying, both in Sydney and in London and in Rotterdam and the Netherlands, to implement some of these interventions to improve outcomes for these critically unwell patients. So in 2012, I had just gotten my letters as a fellow of the College of Intensive Care Medicine, and I'd been tasked with implementing eCPR. I had a simulation background. We did a whole lot of simulation. We'd been doing eCPR in St. Vincent's Hospital in Sydney since about 5 years before I started, in a pretty ad hoc manner. If the right person on the right day was there, we'd get it done. But it wasn't systematic and streamlined. Very soon after that, one of the landmark papers, the CHEER trial, came out of Melbourne. I was in Sydney. We were jealous. We thought, we need to get better. We want to reach their results. They were saying something like 35–40% survival to neurologically intact hospital discharge for patients with resistant ventricular fibrillation. That was pretty good, something to cheer about. We later did the 2 CHEER trial, which basically replicated the results in Sydney. Nobody cares. So the question is, how do you get good? How do you get to the Olympic Simone Biles level of cardiac arrest care? And the answer is not surprising. I did some research. It's not groundbreaking. If you practice, you get better. It's amazing. But if you practice, you get better. But it's not just any sort of practice. It's deliberate practice. It's deliberate practice focusing on breaking this complex intervention, this whole stream of interventions that we're providing, breaking them down into their component parts, overtraining them, bringing them together, training the package of intervention and simulation, training the troubleshooting, building a system, because it's not about the ECMO. It's about the system. You can see, when you train, you get better. I'm not going to read those numbers out for you. What were the barriers? Well, in 2012, everyone thought that we were mad. This was in-hospital cardiac arrest, out-of-hospital cardiac arrest being brought to the emergency department and being cannulated. So there were a lot of political barriers. There were logistical barriers to getting the equipment and the expertise to the patient in a timely manner. But over the course of training the system, we were able to break down these barriers to the point where this is a relatively routine procedure. Complex, time critical, but routine. Oh, yes, of course, that's why it's important. You'll notice that the in-hospital cardiac arrest patients had much faster ECMO flow times because there was the transport that was involved in bringing the patient from the emergency department from the roadside to the emergency department and then cannulating them. Huge time difference in terms of flow. So 10 years ago, we thought, wouldn't it be clever to put this on an ambulance, on a helicopter, and bring it to the patient? But those political barriers meant that it took us more than a decade to actually make that happen. In London, in 2019, we managed to launch the sub-30 trial. Sadly, in 2020, everything got interrupted by COVID. This was a feasibility trial. Can we do this? Can we bring this complex intervention to the patient on the roadside? And the answer is yes, we can. And thankfully, the manuscript has finally been accepted and it will be published soon. But that's old news. Here in Rotterdam, we know we can do that because we're doing it every day. It took us till 2023 to get a study up and running in Sydney of pre-hospital ECPR. But as we rolled it out, we started to realize that actually there's a whole lot more that we can add to cardiac arrest care in the pre-hospital environment beyond just ECMO. ECMO is the tippy top, the pointy bit of the iceberg for cardiac arrest. There are so many other interventions that make a difference. For example, why not bring transesophageal echo into the field? If we really are failing to compress the left ventricle over half the time, wouldn't it be good if we could just fix that? And interestingly, those patients that we were seeing who were not eligible for ECPR in PEA, in asystole, when you move the area of maximal compression, they get ROSC. Intra-arrest arterial blood pressure monitoring, which we're going to hear about in the next session, has also been brought forward to the pre-hospital setting. So in 2024, this year, next month, we're not rolling out a trial in London. We're rolling this out as a service. We strongly feel that this is not experimental. This is not the future. This is the present. What does it look like? Much like here in Rotterdam, a call comes in, or maybe next month someone's smartwatch goes off. They're under 60, and we launch. Within 7 minutes from launch, we're able to be anywhere within the City of London. We arrive on scene, and our question is simply go or no go. It's not, do they meet criteria for ECMO? Do they have a DNA CPR? Don't care. The cannulator is moving to the patient's groin. The on-scene paramedic is deciding, is this a go? As in, is this a patient of the right age with a cardiac arrest? Or are they 90 years old from a nursing home, etc.? And sadly, we were tasked the wrong job. So if it is a go, we get immediate vascular access. And we're placing vascular sheaths, which can be used to transduce blood pressure during the arrest. And you'll be hearing from the East Anglia Air Ambulance after me about the SPEAR project, which has been focusing exactly on this. So I'm not going to steal their thunder. They were supposed to speak before me, but as Denise mentioned, there were some complex logistical issues, which means that they'll be speaking after. Immediate vascular access, an echo, transesophageal echo, or transthoracic, depending on operator skill. We are rapidly upskilling our physicians and paramedics to do focused 4-view transesophageal echo, both to guide area of maximal compression and to confirm the placement of the ECMO wires in the vein and in the artery. And then we stop. Sheets are in. Is this a go for ECMO, or are we going to do something different? So these are our inclusion criteria. They're pretty similar to what people are doing here in Rotterdam. Nothing surprising here. You'll see a little REBOA over on the left-hand side. In the patients that aren't eligible, we're going to hear from our next speaker about how this may be an option to help to improve the outcomes for those patients that aren't ECMO eligible. We confirm our wires. You can see a little wire glinting there in the IVC. We dilate up in a single stage in order to place a 25 French venous cannula and a 17 French arterial cannula and run on to ECMO. Once we have perfusion, our goal is to get that heart beating again and then package the patient and move. And in London, it really is the pre-hospital service that is leading the way. As many of you may be aware, the British are notoriously conservative. And ECPR in hospital only became a pathway this year. And between you and me, and even if you are recording, I guess it's okay, I can say it, nobody's very good at it. Sadly, you need to practice to get good. And nobody's had any practice. And so, it is likely that if you collapse in the parking lot of the hospital, you may get better care than when you go through the doors. And that's interesting. And will lead to some political difficulties. So how do we go from good to better? I've already said, practice, break it down, drill and skill. This is a photo from the helipad in London. We have task trainers readily available. Anytime people are on shift, they can practice their cannulation skills. We've got videos that they can follow. There are mannequins for full simulations, and we do twice monthly training sessions for the whole team, focusing on team skill, non-technical skills and human factors, troubleshooting, etc. Most importantly, in the simulation, there's the debrief, where we think through and we analyze our processes and how we may improve upon what we've done. And we've gone over and over and over each step, trying to build those marginal gains, because every minute counts. And once we have live cases, and with Sydney, we're already doing this, we debrief each individual case as a group for ongoing learning and systems development. We have the 7 pillars of clinical governance, and all of these need to line up in order to make a world-class service that provides this in the most timely manner to these patients. Most importantly, we need to share. And thank you, Denise, for having me here in Rotterdam today. And please, I invite you and anyone in this room to come, to join us, to teach us and to learn from us. We're regularly having people come through to talk about their experiences with cardiac arrest care and to learn from what we're doing. Come and play. We've got a cannulation club. We do ECMO education, transesophageal echo training. Somehow I got lucky in St. Bartholomew's Hospital. The people that invented that simulator there have a workshop in the basement. So I've got 5. If you want to learn it, come and play. And I think I got that in just under 20 minutes. Thank you, guys. That is an awesome question. Nat Cruitt, who is a cardiac anesthesiologist and HEMS physician in Sydney, is doing her PhD on exactly that. So I'm not going to steal Nat's thunder. I think the best answer is we don't know. More is probably better, but how much is enough? I don't know. I think we're overtraining because we want to get good. Once you have those skills, then you need a certain dose in order to maintain them. What we know from other cardiac arrest research, CPR, ACLS, etc., is short, frequent refreshers are better than long but spaced out refreshers. So an hour or even 30 minutes at the beginning of a shift is better than a 2-day course every 3 years. Those are the things that likely matter. Exactly what dose of training is enough is a fascinating question. For example, in Sydney, all of the cannulators were totally new to ECMO. None had seen it before except Nat and myself. And so bringing total novices who don't do a lot of vascular access in their normal job up to the level of ECMO cannulation has been an interesting journey, and Nat has published on that, I think, last month. I can give you the reference if you like. Yeah, it's difficult. I'm curious. I hope that the answer is a 2-day course followed by 1 day a week, followed by once every 3 months. I hope that's the answer, or less. Because if you can do with less training, you're likely to make it more available to a larger number of people. But then the more interventions you pour in, the more complex it gets. How many TOEs do you need? Or TEEs do you need? How much vascular access practice? How much troubleshooting of ECMO? They're all different skills. I don't know.
Thank you very much, Sean. That's a well-deserved applause. For the sake of time, unless there's one very burning question. For the sake... Siep?
What is the bottleneck in achieving around ECMO? Is it fluid access? Is it material access? Is it the transport of the patient?
So our experience has been vascular access. So getting the wire in the right vessel. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So vascular access is probably the rate limiting step. So getting exceptionally good at hitting a moving target that is vasoconstricted because you've been pumping in 1 milligram of adrenaline. That's probably the hardest part. Our patients often have unforgiving body habituses. And so I think that's the hardest bit. The knowledge gap, so that's the skill gap, I think. The knowledge gap is managing the patient after they get onto ECMO. So that's a relatively, until now, subspecialist skill. Most people don't get that in the normal run of their training. And so you can teach a monkey to put in pipes. Once the pipes are in, then you've got to manage the patient. You've got to turn back into a doctor again. And it's a skill set that requires practice. And you don't see a lot of these patients.
Thank you very much, John. Now we're going back online to Chad. Chad is a research fellow, a very famous research fellow from the East Anglian Air Ambulance Services. Chad. He's going to talk about the need of intravascular access, interarterial access during resuscitation, and then also the place for RIBOA, the intra-aortic balloon occlusion, not for traumatic cardiac arrest, but for non-traumatic cardiac arrest, with the aim of raising the diastolic pressure and in this way getting ROSC. Chad, thank you very much for being available at such a short notice. Thank you very much, and well, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to double check that my screen is sharing properly. Could you just let me know if it's sharing? And if you can hear me.
Sharing, but not in the presentation mode. So if you could put it in the presentation mode, it would be awesome. Yeah, there it is. Thank you very
Sorry, bear with me one moment. Technical issues. I can't seem to see it being shared.
And yeah, I can see myself. It's a beautiful picture. Perfect. And if you could turn on your camera also, then we can see you and there's a little bit more interaction.
Sorry, bear with me.
Great picture. Thank you.
I'm just turning it on now. How's that? Can you see the entire screen?
Yeah, that's a much beautiful picture.
Brilliant. So thank you very much for having me this afternoon. My name's Shad, or Shadman Aziz. I'm an emergency physician from London, and I spent the last year working as a research and development specialist at East Anglian Air Ambulance Service. And it's my pleasure to talk to you today about our SPREA project, specifically what the optimal hemodynamic target for pre-hospital goal-directed resuscitation is in out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. So to start with a bit of background to set the scene, survival after out-of-hospital cardiac arrest remains quite poor in the UK, and our survival currently sits at 9%. When we look at this trend over time, it hasn't really changed over the last decade, and this is even apparent in the Art-Stein comparator group of patients with a witnessed initial shockable rhythm. Now, this is considerably lower than several other developed EMS systems which have survival rates of up to 50%. So there's considerable room for improvement in survival in the UK. Now, the first step to any meaningful survival is achieving a return of spontaneous circulation. However, again, we see this stagnation in outcomes over the last decade or so. Now, rightly so in the UK, we've put a large emphasis on improving CPR education and provision of public access to fibrillation. However, when our emergency medical services arrive on scene to a patient in cardiac arrest, Whether or not they've received this bystander intervention has already been determined, and the clinicians are simply faced with a patient in front of them who requires resuscitation that will give them the best chance of ROSC. So we really have to consider every strategy that we can use on scene in order to improve the chances of ROSC. Now, currently in the UK, resuscitation follows the advanced life support algorithms. However, when we look at the ALS algorithms that have been placed over the last decade, we can see that there's been very little change in the way that we deliver resuscitation. Furthermore, CPR providers, including lay bystanders, are taught to deliver CPR in a uniform manner, which doesn't take into account patient anatomy or patient physiology. And CPR is delivered blindly, and other than end-tidal CO2 monitoring, it seems to be skipping for some reason. Other than end-tidal CO2 monitoring, there's little indication about whether CPR is actually having its intended hemodynamic effect. So to talk about cardiac arrest physiology a little bit, we've known since the early 1980s that the chances of ROSC are closely related to the coronary perfusion pressure. And this is the pressure that drives coronary blood flow and is calculated as the difference in the pressure between the proximal aorta and right atrium during the decompression phase of CPR. Now, if an arterial line is in situ during cardiac arrest, we can gain an estimate of the pressure in the aorta by measuring the arterial diastolic blood pressure, or DBP. And this is the afferent component of the coronary perfusion pressure. And the DBP has been shown to be associated with ROSC in multiple animal studies in the 80s and 90s. Now, in recognition of this, in 2013, the American Heart Association published a consensus statement which said that if arterial pressure monitoring is in place during cardiac arrest, provision of successful adult resuscitation depends on maintaining the arterial DBP above 25 millimeters of mercury. And they recommended that chest compression parameters or vasopressor administration, or both, could be delivered in a goal-directed fashion in order to achieve this threshold. However, they provided little advice on how to actually do this, and they admitted that this recommendation was based on limited evidence and expert opinion. To complicate matters further, some groups have advocated using a higher DBP threshold of 35 millimeters of mercury or even 40 millimeters of mercury, which is based on the assumption that the left ventricular end diastolic pressure, which is the resistance to blood flow in the left ventricular myocardium, is supraphysiological in cardiac arrest. And therefore, there is some debate about what the optimal diastolic blood pressure threshold is for goal-directed resuscitation. Furthermore, a recent study by Koyama et al. Found that although there was an association between arterial DBP and ROSC in their cohort of outravascular cardiac arrest patients in Japan, there were also significant associations between mean arterial pressure and systolic blood pressure and ROSC. And they actually found that they had a better ability to discriminate ROSC compared to DBP. So there is some controversy about what the optimal hemodynamic target is for goal-directed resuscitation. And furthermore, there is some controversy about what the best way to analyze DBP is. Do we look at the initial DBP? Do we look at the average value or the maximum value? And that's what we'll try to answer in this study. So how can we answer this? Arterial catheterization has been used at East Anglian Air Ambulance Service since 2014 in recognition of these AHA recommendations. And they've been used in select cases of outravascular cardiac arrest in order to monitor the hemodynamics of CPR and try and increase the arterial DBP where possible. However, the flow switch device, which you can see on the left, was suboptimal for this indication. Due to its short length, it couldn't be used for femoral arterial cannulation, and it was actually found to be quite challenging to cannulate the radial or brachial arteries intra-arrest. So in 2019, alongside some developments in pre-hospital ultrasound in the service, a dedicated femoral arterial access program was started for this indication of hemodynamic monitoring and goal-directed resuscitation in outravascular cardiac arrest. And this program utilized contemporary cath lab quality 5 French femoral arterial sheaths and used a reliable ultrasound-guided Seldinger technique. And after a period of development, it went live in 2021, and we call this program SPEAR. And we recently published a paper which describes the SPEAR program in detail, and I'll leave a QR code for this at the end of the presentation. Now, this cohort of patients gives us an excellent opportunity to look at the hemodynamics of CPR and to answer this question. So the aims of our study were to characterize the association between intra-arrest arterial invasive blood pressure measurements and ROSC in adult patients with out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, and to determine the optimal invasive blood pressure target for pre-hospital goal-directed resuscitation. So a little bit about our service. East Anglian Air Ambulance Service is a physician paramedic staffed HEMS. They operate in the east of England out of 2 bases, one in Norwich and one in Cambridge. There are approximately 2,000 patient contacts per year, of which 30% are out-of-hospital cardiac arrest cases. So this was a retrospective observational study looking at the SPEAR dataset, and it was conducted over a 9-year period from when we introduced our electronic patient record to February 1st, 2024, which was the date of latest patient outcome data. The inclusion criteria were adult patients with presumed medical etiology of cardiac arrest who had invasive blood pressure measurements during the phase of external chest compressions. Data, as I said, was collected during the phase of external chest compressions, but we also conducted a sensitivity analysis which excluded the 2 minutes immediately prior to ROSC, and this was done to exclude any data which could have come from spontaneous cardiac contractions which were unrecognized. So unrecognized ROSC in the 2 minutes prior to the pulse check which recognized ROSC. So what were our outcome measures? Our primary outcome was pre-hospital ROSC, which was defined using the Stein variables as a clinical assessment showing signs of life, comprising either a pulse or generating a blood pressure. And pre-hospital meaning that this was achieved at any time before arrival to a hospital facility. And we also looked at the secondary outcome of survival to hospital discharge. So how do we analyze this data? The IBP parameters were compared in patients who achieved ROSC versus those who did not achieve ROSC, and we used the 2-sample t-test. We also utilized univariate logistic regression to calculate the unadjusted odds ratio for each invasive blood pressure parameter for achieving ROSC. And we also generated receiver operating characteristic curves and looked at the area under the curve for each IBP parameter for discriminating ROSC. I should mention the way that we looked at this data and the way that we looked at the different ways of analyzing the data is we looked at the initial blood pressure measurements as soon as the arterial line went in, the minimum during the phase of external chest compressions, the maximum or peak invasive blood pressure achieved during this phase, the average, which was calculated as a mean, and the change or delta, which was the difference in the maximum achieved blood pressure minus the initial blood pressure. And as I mentioned, we conducted a sensitivity analysis as well. So in this 9-year period, we attended 4,363 out-of-hospital cardiac arrest patients, of which 172 were coded as having had an arterial line. And after excluding patients who only had post-ROSC data or missing data, this left us with 80 patients in the final analysis. So I'm quickly going to run you through the demographics. The mean age in our cohort was 59, and the majority of patients were male. 83% of patients had a witnessed arrest and 76 had bystander CPR, which is what you would expect from patients being attended by our HEMS service. Almost all patients had mechanical CPR instituted at some point during CPR, with a mean end tidal of 3.58 kilopascals and a mean pH of 6.81. 46% of patients had a central femoral arterial cannulation site. So these are patients who had a SPEAR line from 2021 onwards, and the remaining 54% of patients had either a radial arterial line or a brachial arterial line. ROSC was achieved in 34 patients, so 42.5% of the entire cohort. But unfortunately, in this cohort of patients who remained in refractory arrest and ended up having an arterial line inserted, only 4 patients survived the hospital discharge. So this is quite a busy slide, but essentially looks at all the different invasive blood pressure measurements for the systolic, diastolic, and mean arterial pressure, so the initial, minimum, maximum, average, and delta. And we compared these in patients who achieved ROSC versus those who didn't achieve ROSC. And if I just zoom into the significant findings, we found that the maximum and average measurements for both diastolic blood pressure and mean arterial blood pressure and the delta DBP were significantly higher in patients who achieved ROSC. If we visualize this, these data for the maximum DBP measurements, so on this graph, each dot represents a patient and their maximum DBP, and the bar charts represent the mean values with the 95% confidence intervals. We can see clearly that the maximum DBP measurements were significantly higher in patients who achieved ROSC. And interestingly, none of the patients with a maximum DBP less than 28 millimeters of mercury achieved ROSC. We then applied our logistic regression model, and we found that, again, the maximum DBP, average DBP, delta DBP, maximum MAP, and average MAP all had a significant association with ROSC, with the average DBP having the highest odds ratio of 1.07 for every millimeter mercury rise in average DBP. But we found that the maximum DBP had the strongest ability in discriminating ROSC, so the highest area under the curve of 0.83. When we look at the ROP curve for maximum DBP and ROSC, again, we found this area under the curve of 0.83. And we also calculated an optimal cutoff, which was calculated to maximize sensitivity whilst preserving specificity for predicting ROSC. And we found that the optimal cutoff was 35 millimeters of mercury. So the aims of this study were to characterize the association between intra-arrest arterial BBP, invasive blood pressure measurements, and ROSC in our cohort. And to summarize, we found that the maximum and average measurements for both DBP and MAP were significantly higher in patients who achieved ROSC, and the maximum DBP had the most significant association and the highest area under the curve. This supports the AHA guidelines and findings from other services that arterial DBP is a reasonable IBP parameter for the purposes of pre-hospital goal-directed resuscitation. We found that the higher the maximum DBP, the odds of ROSC increased by 5% for every millimeter mercury increase in the maximum DBP. And we found that a target DBP of 35 millimeters of mercury had the greatest balance of sensitivity and specificity for ROSC, which essentially means that this target DBP helps identify patients in whom extended resuscitation may achieve ROSC, so patients who have a DBP of greater than 35, whilst minimizing prolonged resuscitation in patients who are unlikely to achieve ROSC, so those patients who fail to achieve this target DBP of 35 millimeters of mercury. So there were several limitations to this study. This was a retrospective observational cohort study, and there's significant selection bias. So obviously it was done in a single HEM service, and our HEM service obviously attend patients with favorable patient factors, but also spear lines are really inserted in patients who have refractory out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, who haven't responded to standard ALS. And furthermore, we had a limited sample size of 80 due to the low prevalence of intra-arrest blood pressure monitoring, and this precluded our analysis of the secondary outcome of survival to hospital discharge. So what were the kind of main take-home messages? So intra-arrest arterial invasive blood pressure measurement is achievable in the pre-hospital setting. It provides useful information about the hemodynamic response to CPR, and our study supports arterial DBP as the optimal hemodynamic parameter for goal-directed resuscitation in adult out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. Resuscitation should aim to rapidly maximize the DBP in order to increase the chances of ROSC, which is 5% for every 1 millimeter mercury increase in DBP. And again, we found that this threshold of 35 millimeters of mercury was optimal for identifying patients who may achieve ROSC with continued resuscitation. So how can we actually use these data? As the previous speaker said, we know that very often the blind delivery of CPR may potentially be harmful. We may actually be compressing the left ventricular outflow tract. We may not be having the actual hemodynamic response that we want. So using this data with invasive blood pressure monitoring may allow us to deliver more nuanced resuscitation, possibly utilizing POCUS, either transthoracic or transesophageal, to ensure that we're actually compressing the right area, and we can have that real-time feedback from the invasive blood pressure monitoring to see if we are having the intended effect of augmenting that diastolic blood pressure. In addition, multiple studies have demonstrated that adrenaline administration is highly variable, and the effect of adrenaline diminishes with time in ALS. So by utilizing intra-arrest invasive blood pressure monitoring, we can actually see what the hemodynamic response to vasopressor administration is. And this may allow us to move away from blind bolusing of adrenaline every 3 to 5 minutes as per the ALS guidelines to a more nuanced delivery of vasopressors, such as infusions, for example, in order to augment the DBP in a goal-directed fashion. And lastly, this brings us on to RUBOA, which is a potential way of mechanically augmenting the diastolic blood pressure. And the results of our study have informed the current study that we're running at EAAA, which is the ERICA Arrest study, which is a prospective single-arm interventional feasibility study, which looks at the feasibility of performing Zone 1 RUBOA in patients who remain in cardiac arrest despite standard ALS in the UK pre-hospital setting. And what's unique about this study is, in addition to looking at the feasibility of the intervention, using the data captured from SPEAR and our increased, a better understanding of the physiology of intra-arrest arterial blood pressure monitoring, we are looking at whether balloon occlusion has the intended hemodynamic effect, and as well as reporting the key time intervals of the intervention and documenting any adverse events associated with it. The trial is currently ongoing, and we aim to enroll 20 patients with non-traumatic out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. And without kind of talking about our initial results, we've had some success and have already recruited about a quarter of our intended cohort. So please do watch this space. So thank you very much for listening, and here's the QR code to the SPEAR paper that I mentioned. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions for Chad? Just defining RUBOA, the intra-aortic balloon. It is meant to occlude the descending aorta just after the aortic arch in the descending aorta, just to make your circulation very small, much smaller. Kind of cross-clamp the thoracic aorta, just to increase diastolic blood pressure, to increase the chance of ROSC. Chad, am I correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't have said it better myself.
Are there any questions for Chad? Chad, are you in the liberty to say something about the ERICA trial?
I think what I can say is that we've recruited a quarter of our cohort, and the physiology is as you would expect, and as you would expect from the data that I've just presented. I'll leave it there.
Okay, and I'll put it in my words. That is then my liberty, I hope. Is what you would expect is that you would increase diastolic pressure, and then you would hope, but I'm not sure that that will happen, increase the rate of ROSC, and if you increase the rate of ROSC, of course you hope, but that's a hope, that survival increases. And then we have to wait the publication, I think, for the last step to happen, if that's true.
Absolutely. Correct? I think we are still quite early on in the study, so we do have to kind of collect more data before making any conclusions.
Thanks. Sean, do you have one question?
Hi, Shad. Thanks again for jumping in at the last minute. We had a question from the last talk, which was about training people up to provide vascular access during cardiac arrest. Could you talk a little bit about how EAAA is training their HEMS consultants to perform the procedure, and what sort of volume of practice they require?
So with regards to the SPEAR program, the SPEAR program was developed in a very cautious manner in order to achieve the best outcomes. So initially, when the SPEAR program was launched, only consultants with considerable experience in vascular access utilized the procedure. But then very quickly, a course was developed to expand this to the wider organization. And the course focuses on, obviously, the kind of research, the theory behind the technique, hands-on workshops, skills masterclasses in things like ultrasound guided vascular access, Seldinger technique. And once HEMS clinicians in the organization conduct the SPEAR course, this is followed by a period of supervised insertions. So quite possibly the first few insertions will be supervised by a consultant who has experience in SPEAR. And it's very much competency based. So once the person achieves the required competency, they're allowed to undertake the intervention unsupervised. This is then regularly kind of competencies checked through the process of drills and moulages, and we have a competency matrix at EAAA, so every clinician has to demonstrate that they are still competent to continue conducting this. And I think one of the advantages of the SPEAR program, obviously it facilitates goal-directed resuscitation, but it has given us a cohort of clinicians who have become very experienced very quickly in obtaining reliable femoral access. So that allows us to deliver SPEAR, but also opens the way to the ERICA study, REBOA, and potentially an ECPR program in the future.
Thank you very much, Chad, for a fantastic answer. Give a big applause to Chad. Thanks, Chad.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
We're now getting at the end of this evening. Just before the drinks, I think we can wrap up with the definition of insanity. Why do you expect different results if you get over and over and over the same? If you perform the same, why expect different results? In the advanced life support, I'm not talking about the logistic and organization of the basic life support that has improved for the last 20 years. Fantastic, with layman involvement, early defibrillation, involvement of automatic external defibrillations. That has been amazing. But advanced life support, just say it in Dutch, klappen duwen en ophouden. That's it, a little bit. Just shock, compress, and then look at the termination of resuscitation. At the last 20 years, we did not evolve very much. And now I think within 5 years, there'll be a huge, we are now at the tip over point with monitoring. We have to increase monitoring. I just realized that if you get surgery for a perianal abscess, you probably get better monitoring than when you are in cardiac arrest. Isn't that strange? Should we continue like that? We have to monitor better, we have to personalize the cardiac arrest, the advanced life support, we have to personalize it better, or with ultrasound, or with intra-aortic, intra-arterial blood pressure monitoring, and the therapy we have to personalize the therapy. And probably ECPR is a very good one for the therapy side, and how to deliver ECPR. I think, at least in the Dutch setting, I think Inception proved that the way we were going forward is leading to nowhere. So running to the hospital with a chest compression and expect that you just can throw an ECMO machine into the hospital and say, well, this is going to help, this is God's machine, it will help. No, it is the whole setting. It is the ECPR strategy, it's the ECPR protocol that will help. It's not throwing in an ECMO machine. And most probably, pre-hospital ECPR, as Sean has told you, will be the answer, most probably. And that will be the most optimal way to organize ECPR setting. It's not about that ECMO setting is then better. No, the organization is better when you do it pre-hospital. And I surely believe that we're now on a tipping point, and in the coming 5 years will be an amazing period in cardiac arrest, in the pre-hospital detection of cardiac arrest with smartwatches, in personalizing cardiac arrest with A-lines and perhaps ultrasound and therapy with ECMO. Thank you very much for your presence, and we'll see you at the drinks. Thank you very much.